us in attendance this evening for night 3 of our gospel meeting that we are involved in, which is in progress. We are involved in exposing the modern day Pharisees, though there are not any that take this actual title today. But just as we've been discussing, going through, we're doing a character study and finding out if in fact their spirit, their attitude is still involved in the world today. And definitely, as we have started with nights 1 and 2, we have established the fact that in fact that is the case, they are still around, and that we are, if there's a running theme through these sermons, you're hearing us use the term denominational a whole lot, that we are doing our very best to point out these individuals in the religious world around us, and that we are in fact striving to separate ourselves. That while the Pharisees would have been following closely to the law, which is what we are striving to do as well, we are not in the same boat category with the Pharisees, because we are striving to simply follow what God's law is. As Jordan presented last night, one of the problems with the Pharisees was that they were mixing in their own traditions, their man-made traditions, their own doctrines, and thus that produces a perversion and a pollution to what God's law and God's system is. But also within Jordan's sermon was the point of hypocrisy, and how that you have individuals that will teach but they will not do. And thus, when it comes to what the Pharisees' ultimate problem was that they liked to be the ones in charge and for you to listen to them, but they did not want to listen to anybody else. Now, I have run into that personally with some denominational preachers around in this area. When I go to them and try to have Bible discussion, they immediately try to shut me down, and it's, you're going to listen to me, and you're not going to be allowed to talk. With us, that's not the case. We have a question and answer session after every conclusion of our assembly. With our broadcast, we allow individuals to call in and ask us questions and to have dialogue. We leave our comment section open on our YouTube channel so people can leave comments, so they can leave back and forth. We are wanting to have this open discussion and this open dialogue. And as we will go through tonight with our sermon, we'll find even further emphasis on how that will separate us from this Pharisee mentality. Another thing that individuals might be wondering and asking is, well, what is the goal of these studies? Is it simply to just point out that the denominational world around us is wrong and mistaken, and that you in the Church of Christ are correct? That's one aim of it. But in that aim, there's an aim within it. Our aim is the same as what was prophesied about Jesus when he would come to this earth the first time. Luke 4:18. Jesus reading from the book of Isaiah. And in reference to himself, Jesus reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel." This is our main goal. We want to teach people what the scriptures say, and only what the scriptures say, within their context and with proper application. To preach the gospel, but notice, to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised. Our aim and our goal with this information, with this study, this is an effort of preaching the gospel. And in preaching the gospel, we are preaching it so as to heal those that are brokenhearted, those that are struggling with the woes of life, that we are wanting to actually get involved with them and to encourage them to overcome the difficulties that this life has. That's one area that the gospel is involved in doing. But then also, you have being presented to preach deliverance to the captives. In preaching the gospel, we are presenting freedom. Now, some might view that as being contradictory, considering all of the rules that we would want to follow and all the rules that we want everybody else to follow. How can you be free? How can you be delivered if all you're wanting to do is to follow a set of rules? Rules are restrictive. Rules are binding. Rules are designed so as to hem you in, not make you free. But you see, that's how God's system works. God's system works backwards to how we think about these situations and these elements. to preach deliverance to the captives, liberty to them that are bruised. We are trying to free people, not only freeing them from their sins, but freeing them from the persecution and the overbearance that those in power in religion can have over them. James would write in this fashion, James chapter 1 and verse 25, but whoso looketh into the perfect law, and notice what this law is. It is a law of liberty. It's a law of freedom. It is a law that delivers the captives, and is perfect, it's whole, and is complete. And continue within therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deed. We want people to have liberty. That is the aim of this gospel meeting, is to set the captive free, to bring those which are in bondage to liberty. But liberty, as can be seen with these two verses and with what we discussed in the first two nights, liberty is connected to law. If you do not have law, you cannot have liberty. Now, we are living in this very time, today, we are living in a time where we are being shown an experiment of what a lack of law produces. Most people think, well, if we get rid of law, then we'll have more freedom. And look at what's around us. A man can be a woman can be a man. We have drag queens in our school system, teachers that are indoctrinating our children on critical race theory and transgenderism, gender identity issues. We have criminals that are running loose on our streets. That's lawlessness. That's a lack of law. That's a lack of restriction. According to the religious world around us, what should we be living in right now? We should be living in a paradise, should we not? Utopia. You get rid of rule, you get rid of law, do what you want, makes things better. Are things better? Things are worse now than they've ever been. This is a prime example during our lifetime of what happens when liberty is sacrificed by removing law. Not only does the Bible teach us this, but even within our own governmental documents. This is the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. And notice what our forefathers recognized. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. What did our founding fathers recognize? That when you get away from the laws of our God, you need to stand up against that government. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Based upon what? Our founding fathers recognized a higher power, the Creator, the God of heaven, and they established a government that is to run side by side with that. And with these documents producing liberty, the preamble of the United States Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, in order to establish justice, in order to ensure domestic tranquility, in order to provide for the common defense, in order to promote the general welfare, in order to promote and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Our founding fathers recognized in order to have liberty, you must have law. And law that is based upon what God has said. Alex de Tocqueville, in his Democracy in America, He is a traveler from France coming to look at the United States and view what it is that made it a great experiment. In the introduction, the editor writes, quote, because of his concern lest Americans lapse into being mere creatures of comfort, he brings up again and again the need for them, the Americans, to have religion. Only religion, Alexis feels, can, quote, propagate throughout society a taste for the infinite, an appreciation of greatness, and a love of spiritual pleasures. Here are individuals that we would view as though we have eclipsed when it comes to our knowledge. But yet they continue to show just how much smarter they actually are than us. Because they recognize you cannot have liberty without law. And yet we live in a society today that says, well, let's remove law and we'll have more liberty. Doesn't work. The editor goes on to write in another section of the introduction, Alexis fears Americans' excessive love of prosperity. And in the year before his death, Alexis wrote to a friend on this topic, quote, I have never been more convinced than I am today that liberty and religion, through a combined effort are capable of raising men out of the mire in which democratic equality naturally plunges them as soon as one of these two support is lacking. Where are we today? We are in the mire. Why? Because our liberties are being stripped from us because more and more of our society is saying we want less religion. Getting rid of God's laws, and we are becoming more and more enslaved. Not only to sin, not only to wickedness, but even to those that have a desire for power. John Adams is quoted as saying, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. If we are going to move away from religion, we are going to destroy ourselves. So what's the aim of our gospel meeting? To save souls and to save our nation. To save our communities. By standing up and saying things need to change. And what's needing to change is we need to return to religion. Not just any religion, but to God's religion. Last night, Jordan presented, the Pharisees were establishing their own religion. Matthew 16:12, then understood they how that he bade them not beware the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. Jesus labels this correctly. He calls it for what it is. This is not the doctrine. This is not the instruction or teaching of God. He made no mistake when he called it the doctrine of the Pharisees. What they were teaching did not belong to God. It belonged to them. They were establishing their own religious system. Now, what do we have individuals today going around and doing? Well, I'm of the Baptist doctrine. I'm of the Methodist doctrine. I'm of the Presbyterian doctrine, Episcopalian doctrine. Oh, you're not of the doctrine of Christ? That's where the Church of Christ comes in. We have no other doctrine than what Christ has taught. If you're going to ask us what doctrine we hold, you might as well ask us what God we serve. There's only one God, and he only has one doctrine. They were busy establishing their own way. And some might raise the question, but they're using God's word. That's true. But just as Jordan mentioned, if you sprinkle your own inventions into God's teaching, it's no longer God's teaching. You've perverted it. You've manipulated it. It's now evolved into something else. That is your teaching. And there is the problem. As was mentioned last night, Matthew 15:2-3. Why do thy disciples transgress the traditions of the elders? So you see, they're not even trying to hide it. Where do these traditions come from? Remember the question that Jesus asked the Pharisees? What about John's baptism? Is it from heaven or is it from men? Is it of your elders? Oh no, it's from heaven. They're not even trying to hide where their doctrines came from. Well, God didn't tell us to do this. These are just things that we are implementing. For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. But Jesus answered and said unto them, why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? The idea that you can have your doctrine and I have mine and everything's going to be fine, Jesus addresses that and says, no, you transgress. To transgress means to go beyond where your limit is. To insert your own tradition. You transgress the commandment of God. You break it. And then verse 9, Jesus says, in vain they do worship me. God does not just accept all worship. There is some worship that is vain. But in vain they do worship me. Why? Teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. So what people need to start asking when they are in an assembly, when they go to church, they need to start asking themselves, what am I listening to? Are these the commandments of God that I'm listening to? Or are these the commandments of men? But what we want to consider tonight is what is happening when men do this. They are establishing their own doctrine. And Jesus presents information to show that they are trying to put themselves in a higher position than they actually belong. Our subject for tonight, Matthew 23, a Pharisee usurps God. We have this word usurp also found in 1 Timothy 2, verses 11 and 12, on how that it's not permitted for a woman to teach over a man or to usurp authority over him. But when a person, not just the Pharisees here, but when anybody is involved in building their own doctrinal system, when they are busy in trying to build their own faith system, their own religion, you are usurping God, which is you are pushing him out of his rightful place. God is supposed to be supreme. God is supposed to be in charge. But if I am busy making the rules, then what am I doing? I'm making myself God. In Matthew 11, in verse 12, Jesus had already made mention of these actions during his lifetime. He writes and he says, and from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. You see the same language mentioned in John 6:15. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. Same Greek word in both texts. What were the people trying to do? They were trying to seize on John and Jesus to make them what they wanted. Improper interpretation of the prophets and not applying properly what was said. And thus they did not like what Jesus was doing. They did not like what John was doing. So we'll try to mold them into what we want. Jesus did come to be king, just not the kind of king that they were expecting. And that is what the Pharisees did. They seized on religion, not to glorify and to elevate God, but to glorify and elevate themselves. Matthew 23, verses 1 through 4. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. Right away we can see the immediate contrast between what Jesus does and what Jesus' followers do. Notice this. Jesus did not say this in a closed door meeting. This entire chapter, where Jesus calls out the Pharisees for their hypocrisy, is said before the multitude and to his disciples. Jesus did not worry about who heard it, because what he's saying is the truth. The Pharisees need to hear this. And that's part of the reason why we are so public with what it is that we're presenting. with what we're teaching, because that's how Jesus behaved. People need to hear the truth, and the truth of how they're behaving. These men were hell-bound. And Jesus explains why in this chapter. What Jesus is doing, pointing out error, judging, that's not Pharisee behavior. If you want to see Pharisee behavior, all you have to do is go 3 chapters over and you find out what Pharisee behavior is really like. Matthew 26, 3 and 4. Then assembled together the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people unto the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him. Right there is Pharisee behavior. In a dark room somewhere where nobody can see them, secretly meeting, secretly scheming, plotting out how to commit murder. Jesus is out in the open. And when they came to arrest Jesus, he points that out. I was in the temple with you daily. Why are you now coming out with torches and staves as though you're coming to face a criminal? Ask yourself the question, how many denominational preachers do you witness out in public defending what they teach? How many denominational preachers can you hear boldly proclaiming and boldly preaching against sinful activity? I do not see very many. That is Pharisee behavior. They won't come out in public so as to answer us, to deal with us, but just like the Pharisees here having secret meetings, we have individuals in the community, and what are they doing? Well, we're having secret meetings on how we can figure out how to stop you. Why not just answer us? Why not just come to us, talk to us? We're reasonable. We're peaceful. We're willing to have the dialogue. No, we'd rather do this and find some back doorway to have you stopped. Now, I want to stop denominations just as much as they want to stop us. I do not appreciate what it is that the denominational world is teaching. It's false doctrine, it's their own traditions. But the best way to handle it is the way Jesus did. Out in the open, out in the light, for all to see. So here's what they're doing. Jesus calls this out in public in verse 3. Verse 2. Saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. What does that even mean? What does it mean that the scribes, Pharisees are sitting in Moses' seat? Well, remember who Moses was. Moses was called of God. Moses was a prophet. Moses was an authority over the people. So when it is saying that the scribes and Pharisees are sitting in Moses' seat, it is saying that they sit in the seat of authority. And we find that shown to us in Exodus chapter 18 and verse 13. Exodus 18:13, it came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood by Moses from the morning unto the evening. Moses would sit and judge the people from morning until evening. So once again, we can find out that, in fact, judging is not a bad thing. If it was, why is Moses doing it? You need judging. You're going to have problems. You're going to have difficulties. You're going to have conflict with each other. So what do you need? You need somebody to sit in a place of authority so as to rule, make rulings on it. So judging is not bad if you're following God's commands, as Moses was. If you follow God's commands and not man's commands, judging is fine. And that's the discussion of Matthew chapter 7. By what measure you measure others, they'll be measured back to you. If you have an individual who is judging correctly, then you'll love it when you have somebody judging over you. But if you have somebody that's going to pollute that office and pervert that office, this can become a very terrible situation very fast. He would sit and judge, and verse 16 says, and when they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of God and his laws. There's the judging stick. There's the measurement. What was it that Moses was judging by? Not by his own understanding, not by his own commandments, but he would make known to them the statutes of God. So is it wrong for someone to continue in this work? Just the fact that they sit in Moses' seat, is that a problem within itself? No. Because inside of this chapter, Moses' father-in-law Jethro will come to him and say, Moses, what you're doing is not good. You cannot handle this all by yourself. You're going to wither away. And Jethro encourages him, choose out other wise men that will be able to judge also with you. Judging is not bad. And it's not bad that they're continuing in this process of sitting in Moses' seat. But just like we read about our government today, you put people in this position with no morals, and the office is corrupted. Now we need to raise the question, why was this corrupted? It's already been established. They taught their own doctrine. They brought their own rules into it. They brought their own regulations. And they are not simply making known to the people the statutes of God. Now here's what Paul had to say about this as well. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and beginning in verse 3, this is talking about the same subject. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Remember ye not that, when I was yet with you, I told you these things. And now ye know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way. Now, most people want to make this some type of future event. We're still waiting for this to happen, the son of perdition to be made known. Or some individuals want to make it about Roman Catholicism. It has its application there. This applies to anybody that would attempt to take the place of God, just like the Pharisees did. Moses' seat is literally God's seat. Because all he was doing was telling you, this is what God has said. But the Pharisees put themselves there, started teaching their own traditions and their own doctrine. And guess what? That's no longer God's seat. That's their seat. This has its application about the Jews. This individual who sits in the temple, showing himself that he is God, that's the Pharisees, Sadducees, chief priests. Usurping God's place, putting themselves where God is supposed to be. And I know this to be the case because look at the time signature. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Paul says this is already happening. What I've just mentioned to you about him sitting in the temple, showing himself that he is God, it's already happening. Who was it that was doing that? It was the Pharisees and the Sadducees. This applies to any group that will set aside God's commandments for their own. So anyone that will try to insert their own traditions and their own doctrine contrary to what God has said, notice, you're not working with God. Paul says, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God. You're trying to usurp the throne. You are trying to rule instead of having God rule. So in fact, we're right back in the Garden of Eden, are we not? How was it that the serpent was able to beguile and tempt Eve? Oh, God has told you not to eat of the fruit because he knows in the day that you eat that fruit, Your eyes will be open, and you will be as gods. What is it that all of us struggle with? We want to be the captains of our own lives. We want to be our own rulers. We want to be our own kings instead of actually submitting ourselves to this law so that we can, in fact, have liberty. So back to Matthew 23, Jesus gives a positive and a negative about the Pharisees in this situation. They sit in Moses' seat. Well, they know the law. During this time frame, when it comes to anybody that knows the law better, there's nobody that knows the law better than the Pharisees. So here's the positive. All, therefore, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. Because it's from the law. This is what God has said. And here is the Son of God, and he is telling people, encouraging them, where the Pharisees are teaching from the law, you need to do that. You do that, and you do it without delay. The word observe can also be translated as to watch over, to protect, as a fortress. So here we are towards the end of Jesus' ministry, and how does he still teach about observing the law? You protect it. You guard it. You keep it like a fortress where it's safe, and you do not let it come to harm. You observe and you do, which means to exercise. You perform it, and you do it without delay. Again, how does Jesus feel about the law? It's good, it's wholesome, it's pure, it's from God. You need to observe it, you need to protect it, and you need to do it immediately. That's the positive of the situation, but then here's the negative. They sit in Moses' seat, all therefore whatsoever they bid you to do, that observe and do. But there's the contrast. Do not ye after their works. Well, what are their works? What is that leaven? What is that doctrine? For they say and do not. It's hypocrisy. That was what was wrong with the Pharisees. That's what's wrong with religion today. We have a whole host of society that wants nothing to do with religion. And why is it? Well, I don't want to go to church because church is full of hypocrites. Well, you just need to find a place that's really trying to improve themselves. Now, why is that a problem that we're facing today with hypocrisy? Because the denominational world has a man-made tradition that they teach that says once you're saved, you're always saved. And do you know what that does? That does exactly what Alexis de Tocqueville was afraid of. It produces comfort. It produces complacency. I do not have to grow. I do not have to work. I do not have to do anything. Well, guess what? If that's how you're going to live your life and you're not doing the things that God requires you to do, you're going to be a hypocrite. You're going to say, oh yeah, here's what you need to do. Well, are you doing that? Well, who are you to judge me? That's what the Pharisees do. They are so quick to deflect and have a defense to where, oh buddy, they can tell you what to do, but man, don't try to turn around and tell them what to do. The corruption of power. For they say and they do not. They say, oh man, they can preach it. And just so that we're being fair and that we're being consistent, this is not only a problem in the denominational world, this is a problem inside of the Lord's church as well. There is a whole host of our brotherhood, members of the churches of Christ, that are right here. Oh, we have some great speakers. But they're right here with the Pharisees that, all right, they can preach it, but they do not practice it. Luke 12:1. As Jordan presented to us, as Jesus is presenting to us. Beware ye of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. They talk the talk, but they do not walk the walk. And this is what is missing from religion today, because everybody's trying to get rid of law. You get rid of law, you get rid of religion, what do you have to do? What walk do you have to walk? Well, it's whatever I make it. And people think, just as we said, they think that that brings freedom. But we're going to see what Jesus has to say about it here in just a moment. So here we are once again, right back into night 1. Matthew 5:18 through 20. What does Jesus say? What they teach you, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. Night 1 was Matthew 5:18 through 20. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass from one jot or one tittle, shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Has Jesus changed his message any? This is the beginning of his ministry. Matthew 23, we're towards the end of his ministry. Anything changed? No. Whatever the law says, you do it. For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, what is that? The Pharisees will teach it, but they will not do it. So how are we to be better than the Pharisees? Just simply do it. Follow it. And follow it with a proper motive. As we discussed in night 1, realize, recognize why we have the law. It's to help us. It's to keep us safe. It's to protect us from harm from others. It's to give us a means of justice when people do harm us and do us wrong, to where we can live without fear. 1 John chapter 5, John writes to us that this is the love of God, that he's given us these commandments. What we have been studying, and what we will continue to study in this gospel meeting, can all be seen in denominationalism. The Church of Christ is not a denomination. We have no other creed than the Bible. We have no other manual than the Bible. What Jesus teaches to be a Christian, we follow it. And we do not try to explain anything away. We do not try to minimize any of his commandments. Just like Jesus says here, whatever they bid you observe it and do it. But you talk to 10 different denominational preachers, and guess what you'll find? Just on a simple question of salvation. You ask 10 different preachers in town, what must I do to be saved? You'll get 10 different answers. When we only have one doctrine. Or at least we're supposed to. They are the Pharisees. And that they live in hypocrisy. They teach, oh yeah, here's what you need to do. But then they'll turn right around in the same sermon and say, oh, but you don't need to listen to me. That's hypocrisy. Not only is that hypocrisy, but thank you for wasting 30 minutes of my life that I will never get back. What we are teaching inside of the Lord's church, these are matters of salvation. This is not playtime. We're dealing with matters of life and death. Because that's what God has said throughout the Old Testament. That's what Jesus has even said in the New. If you will follow me, do what the will of the Father is, you'll be blessed. But if not, then you will be rejected. And we take that seriously. The denominational world around us is Pharisees because they uphold their own traditions above what God has commanded. Now, what does this produce? Jesus gives us the answer. What happens when positions of authority are abused and corrupted? What happens when God's religion is tampered with? For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne. Oppression comes. When you start meddling with God's religion, it doesn't bring more freedom. That does not bring more liberty. That brings more constriction. The very thing that John says that the commandments of God are not supposed to be, that's what the Pharisees turned the law of God into. It's a heavy burden. It's grievous. And John says, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous. How does this happen? How is this contradiction here? It's when people stop following God's commandments. This is what we have in our world today. We do not have more liberty. We do not have more freedom. We have oppression all around us. So here's the very thing that we opened with. You set aside God's religion. You set aside God's law, his commandments. You get oppression, not freedom. And so people need to raise the question. They need to ask themselves the question, am I in a religious system that is oppressive? That they are, in fact, making rules that I cannot read about in the scriptures? Do they have rules for thee, but they're not rules for me? That has become a very popular slogan throughout our country, has it not? Our government, our politicians, they have rules for us, but they don't have any rules for them. But what are they doing? Oh, they're giving us what we want, right? Let people have their abortions. Let the people have all these freedoms. These aren't really freedoms. With the government shekels comes the government shackles. It's the same in religion. You are in a system where they are saying anything goes, and you think to yourself, oh man, that's going to be so liberating. Nope. Because they are the ones calling the shots. If a person is in an oppressive religious system, that's not God's religion. And you're not following God's commands. But here's the flip side to this. We cannot just blame others for this oppression that's taking place. We also have to look at ourselves. I find God's law oppressive. I find God's commandments grievous when I am doing something that breaks his law. So this is one area where individuals will wrongfully accuse us of being Pharisees because we're in discussion with them, and in the discussion we find out that in some form they are living in sin. And we point that out, and they want to say, oh, you're making me feel bad. And they want to say that we're the problem. No, no, no. We're not the problem. You can't blame the doctor because he finds a tumor. You can't blame the doctor when he points out you've got some type of infection. You cannot blame us when we come and examine your life and find that you are living in sin. That's on you. Well, I don't like that. That's oppressive to me. Not because of me, because of what you're doing. So this ends up being a situation where it can be people in power that make laws that do not need to be there, and thus they are oppressing the people. But if we are going to break God's law, and we have things in our lives that, you know what, I just really want to do this, then what God says about it is going to become a problem. Just like with that school zone. Oh, I've got somewhere to be, and that school zone is getting in my way. Not the school zone's fault. Because of the individual. When we consider what these individuals are doing and how that they were misusing religion and that it in fact hurts people, notice what else Jesus has to say. It creates heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, to be carried. That's what this produces. Who carries this is the next question. It's the people under those in power that end up carrying the heavy load. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. Who gets the short end of the stick? Who gets the heavy yoke? It's the people sitting in the pew. You end up being the one that carries the load. You end up being the one that's abused and mistreated inside of the system. You become the beast of burden. And that's all you are. The yoke is on everyone else, and specifically the weak of society. Notice how Jesus points this out throughout his teaching. Matthew 18:6. But whoso shall offend one of these little ones? Who are the little ones? They're the lepers. They're on the outcast of society. It's the woman with the issue of blood that has to live outside the city. And notice Jesus says, whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea. Well, I thought Jesus was all about love and compassion. It depends on which party you are. For the little one that's being offended, this is compassion. This is mercy. They are being mistreated. They are being beaten down with a heavy load. They are being oppressed. And what does Jesus say needs to happen to their oppressor? Justice. Hang a millstone about their neck and cast them in the sea. People need to recognize and they need to understand that God's religion, God's law, has an equal amount of compassion and mercy as it does to justice. They would look at this individual and say, oh, well, that's terrible. You wouldn't be saying that if you were the one being oppressed. You would be saying, thank you for removing that terrible person. He describes them as the little ones in Matthew 18. How are they described in Matthew 21, verse 12? Who is it the Pharisees put these heavy burdens on? And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. These things are not in the Bible just for a filler, just to take up space. It is very important that Jesus is describing what these individuals are doing. Who are they abusing? Who are they offending? Who are they crushing under their load? To sacrifice a dove is a poor man's sacrifice. You could not afford to buy a lamb or to buy a bull. It goes down the line of what you could buy with what you're being blessed with. The lowest that you could go was a dove. Who are the Pharisees abusing? It's these little ones. They are abusing the poor people, the weak and the defenseless. And Jesus comes to their aid and he points out who the oppressors are. But what does our society today say? No, just leave it alone. Can't say anything nice. Don't say anything at all. Tell that to Jesus. And one more. In our actual text, Matthew 23:14. He says unto them, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. All throughout this chapter, you'll find that word being used, hypocrites, for ye devour widows' houses. Here are the Pharisees making their own laws and making their own traditions. You see, we're getting rid of God's law and we're going by whatever's in our heart. We're just going by whatever makes us feel good. Well, that will produce more freedom. No. It oppresses because it puts man in God's seat. Here they are, and they are devouring widows' houses. A widow is a defenseless individual. But notice what they're doing. And for a pretense, make long prayer. Therefore, ye shall receive the greater damnation. Jesus looks at these individuals and he says, you are not going to escape. But look what they're doing. They're praying. They love God, right? No. It's a pretense. It's a fabrication. It's a cover-up. It is a show of godliness to cover up ugly actions. And you don't think this kind of stuff is going on today? I know of at least 2 widows back where I came from in Virginia. 2 widows that once they obeyed the gospel and they became members of the Lord's church, the churches that they were with, those preachers started coming after their land, started coming after their property. This stuff is still alive and well today. And guess who stood up for them? Guess who stood up to protect them and defend them? We did. The Church of Christ. And we showed the light, we shared the light on what was happening, we put those preachers on television. And they backed off real quick. When we are talking about us being the true people of God, we mean it. We will take action. We will go to bat for you. We will defend you if the cause is right and the cause is just. Because that's what Jesus would do. And that's what we're doing with this gospel meeting, in shining the light on these false doctrines and the false teachings that are around us. You are being oppressed. You are being abused and misused. We're trying to liberate you and bring you into the Lord's salvation. As we said, in the Church of Christ, we do not have an extra manual, creed, or catechism. We simply have the Bible. What God says we follow with no addition or subtraction or weakening of any of his positions or his teachings. And in the Church of Christ, we have Jesus where he is supposed to be. Nobody here is making the rules. I'm not making the rules. Jordan is not making the rules, or anybody else in the assembly. If we have a decision that we need to make, we have the mindset of, okay, let's go to the Bible and see what we can find. We let God make our decisions. Hebrews 10:12, we have recorded for us, but this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God. In 1 Timothy 6:15, Paul wrote to Timothy, which in his times he shall show who is the blessed and only potentate. Potentate means supreme, top tier, number one in position, the King of kings and Lord of lords. In the Church of Christ, we are not trying to steal the throne. Christ is our head. Colossians 1:18, Jesus is the head of the body, the church. He is the head. He has established the rules. We are simply the body, and we do what the head tells us. So we are doing this. Our goal is to have individuals come out of denominationalism and become a member of the Church of Christ, where freedom is, where liberty is. Why? Because we will be helping you to follow God's religion. Not just simply to follow the letter, but to recognize the spirit behind it, the why we are doing this. Become a member of the Church of Christ today. Set aside those man-made names and man-made doctrines and find liberty in His perfect law. And be joined together with people that will do and teach. The Lord's invitation is still the same. While the Pharisees create heavy burdens and grievous to be borne in the same, we're not in the same chapter, in the chapter that we've already studied in Matthew 11, 28 through 30, the Lord's invitation is, come unto me, all ye that are weak and heavy laden, and He'll give you rest. That's what we're offering. Refreshing. You're tired of how things are going? You want to change? Become a Christian. Notice I said a Christian, not a Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, Catholic, anything else like that. No such creature in the Bible. We just simply need to be Christians. And the Christians are made by following God's word only. Jesus said, come unto me, all ye that are weak and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me. For my yoke is easy. Notice the contrast. What are the Pharisees doing? Heavy burdens, grievous to be borne. Jesus says, if you'll follow me, if you'll do what I say, oh, it's a yoke, but it'll be easy. It's a burden, oh, but it's light. Not like what any man will put on you. Obey His gospel, have your sins forgiven by being washed in His blood. And that's what we're offering for our community. And we offer this as we stand, as we sing together.